All right, and welcome back to the channel. Glad to have you with us here. There's been a lot going on in the news and since the last video, so we're going to take a look at all that. But first, as always, if you'd like to support the program, you can do all the usual things that you hear on the other videos. Like, share, subscribe, hit the notification button. Send the video to a friend who might be like-minded on these issues. And if you would like to support the channel, you can do so in the description box below or from the About section of the channel. I'm a content creator as well as a Christian missionary outside of the United States, so if you'd like to support the work that goes into the creation of content or support the sharing of the gospel, supporting the Great Commission, you can do so through those means. But as we said, a lot going on now in the news, so let's just get right into it. Since the last video, there's been plenty going on, and as always, if this is your first video, we view news, current events through the lens of the Bible, through a Judeo-Christian worldview, and specifically through the lens of prophecy. There are many people who study prophecy, known as eschatology, who think we are in the times just preceding a time known as the Great Tribulation, the last 7 years of human history, at the end of which Jesus would return to earth. And so through this lens, we'll take a look at what's been going on. And we start out here with Ephesians 6, verse 12. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. And if you're paying attention to it at all, whether you're secular, Christian, or otherwise, you can see we are living in times of evil. We are living in the age of deception. And so this verse appears to be what we see in the world around us, and in particular, Matthew 24. Matthew 24 is one of these verses that articulates the general conditions surrounding the 7 years of tribulation, which is also known as the time of Jacob's trouble. This is when God leaves off with the Gentile church. There was 2,000 years of church age after Jesus had finished his ministry on earth. And after that time period, God will turn his attention once again to the nation of Israel during the time of the tribulation, known as the time of Jacob's trouble, which is also the 70th week of Daniel, which can be found in Daniel 9. And so you can take a look at all these things. But Matthew 24 is a good one that lays out general conditions surrounding the time period that we look for the rapture of the church, where God removes his Christian church in order to turn his attention back to the nation of Israel, in the same way that Noah and his family was removed during the time of the flood, and they were sealed up in the ark. So Matthew 24, verse 1, it says, And Jesus went out and departed from the temple. This was the temple that was around during Jesus' ministry. And his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left one here, one stone upon another, that shall not be thrown down. That conversation probably took place around 29 AD, and that prophecy was fulfilled in 70 AD, when the Romans sacked the city of Jerusalem and threw down the temple. Verse 3, And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? And Jesus answered and said unto them, Take heed that no man deceive you. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. Have you seen that in the news? Of course, we saw a lot of that in the last century, and especially today. You've got things going on all around the world. Flashpoints between China and India, flashpoints in the South China Sea, tensions between the U.S. and China over that area, which is a main shipping area. China has built some artificial islands there to claim territory in that area of the world, and then of course things going on in the Middle East, Syria in particular, Israel just this week once again striking Iranian targets in Syria, where you have a number of nations operating in the area of Syria, which Israel is protecting against. So many things going on, wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation. As we saw in one of our previous videos, that term nation actually can be translated as race. So race against race, kingdom against kingdom. Kingdom there can refer to nation states. And there shall be famines and pestilences, pestilences like COVID-19, as 2020 is the year of COVID-19, and I'm sure we'll see more of it. They don't want to let that one go. 2020 being the year that the New World Order, the global government, what have you, is very clearly deciding they're all in on that one, trying to make 2020 the year that all this takes place, and QAnon attempting to stop this sort of thing. And so we see a lot of tension in 2020, deep state, New World Order making their move, and potentially nationalists, patriots within the U.S. and elsewhere seeking to stave that off. So kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences, COVID-19, and earthquakes in diverse places. All these things are the beginning of sorrows. So as we said previously, it seems that that's where we are now, the beginning of sorrows. On the end times timeline, you've got the beginning of sorrows. Most people who follow Bible eschatology believe there's something called the rapture of the church, and then followed either right after or closely thereafter is the 7 years of tribulation. And so we're probably somewhere in the midst of the beginning of sorrows, as we've seen going on this year in the year of 2020. Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. This referring to Christians, and as we're seeing more and more resistance, no longer indifference, but more resistance and hatred of Christianity. And then shall many be offended. Have we seen that? Is everybody offended about something these days? And shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. Once again, you're seeing this grow. And many false prophets shall rise and shall deceive many. A lot of deception going on these days. False prophets, including those in the truth movement, let's say. A lot of people who you probably follow, truthers and QAnons and whatnot. There are plenty of false prophets in and amongst this crowd. And because iniquity shall abound, and love of many shall wax cold. Have you seen the love of people wax cold? People love each other these days, or is it more of the opposite? And iniquity, let's take a look at iniquity there. Iniquity can be correctly translated as without law, lawlessness, wickedness. And we see a lot of lawlessness going on these days on the news. And the love of many shall wax cold, but he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. So we'll stop right there. So as we've seen over the last week or so, much in the news about the racial tensions going on that grew out of the George Floyd situation, trying to stir up racial animus, racial tension that they, deep state, would hope would grow into a race war, a civil war. And as we've seen the Trump administration continue to trumpet, no pun intended, from the beginning of the administration, be wary of fake news. And so I thought it would be good to start off first with the clip that kind of shows us the genesis maybe of the fake news movement, and in light of what we're seeing today, all kinds of fake news, CNN, MSDNC, and all of the usual players attempting to stir racial division and racial tension by basically stirring up people's emotions, because that's always how it works, right? They want to stoke your emotions to guide you to a certain conclusion in the way that they frame the media narrative on the news, current event topics of the day. And so here we'll look at, it's actually a longer clip. This is about 9 minutes long, but I thought that it's important to share because there's a gentleman here that they're going to talk about named Edward Bernays, who, whether you have heard of him before or not, has gone a long way in shaping the world that you live in. Edward Bernays is the guy that coined the term public relations. After World War II, they found propaganda was extremely effective, but the term propaganda had a stigma connected to it because essentially it referred to brainwashing. And so they had to change that name to find something that was more palatable publicly. And so Edward Bernays coined the term public relations. Edward Bernays is one of the people who has done the most to shape your world, even though many of you have never heard of him. Edward Bernays was the nephew of Sigmund Freud. He was a part of the Freud family, and he was contracted essentially by corporations to use propaganda for peacetime. And one of the ways he did that was to essentially create and set up consumer society, getting people to buy products that they didn't need, creating classes of products, all that do the same thing essentially, but you have your cheap version of a product, the middle class version of a product, and the luxury version of a product, all essentially doing the same thing, but getting you to buy things that are maybe unnecessary. And so he created consumer society and really created fake news, as we'll see. It's a 9-minute clip. Normally I like to choose shorter clips because I know attention spans are short these days, but my videos are long form in general anyways, so just bear with me on this. It's an extremely interesting 9 minutes, and this is part of a larger treatise on Bernays and his role in creating the world that we live in, essentially. It's 4 one-hour parts. It's called Century of Self. It was put out by the BBC, and it's really worth your time if you're so inclined and interested in this type of thing to check it out. It can be dry in parts. It is academic in its presentation, and so some parts are a little bit dry, but there are interspersed throughout the 4 one-hour sessions are just some gold nuggets in there, including the one I'm about to show you. So let's take a look at Edward Bernays and how he played a part in what we know today as basically this is all we have now, fake news.
But the power and influence of the Freud family in America was about to grow even more. Politicians were about to turn to Anna Freud's cousin, Edward Bernays, for help in a time of crisis. He was going to manipulate the inner feelings and fears of the masses to help America's politicians fight the Cold War.
I don't mean to say, and no one can say to you, that there are no dangers. Of course there are risks if we are not vigilant, but we do not have to be hysterical.
In 1953, the Soviet Union exploded its first hydrogen bomb, and the fear of nuclear war and communism gripped the United States. Those in power became concerned about how to reassure the population. Committees were set up and public information films made, appealing for calm in the face of new threats, like nuclear fallout.
It's the fallacy of devoting 85% of one's worrying capacity to an agent that constitutes only about 15% of an atomic bomb's destroying potential.
At this point, Edward Bernays was living in New York. In the 1920s, he had invented the profession of public relations and was now one of the most powerful PR men in America. He worked for most of the major corporations and advised politicians, including President Eisenhower. Like his uncle Sigmund, Bernays was convinced that human beings were driven by irrational forces. The only way to deal with the public was to connect with their unconscious desires and fears. Bernays argued that instead of trying to reduce people's fear of communism, one should actually encourage and manipulate the fear, but in such a way as it became a weapon in the Cold War. Rational argument was fruitless.
What my father understood about groups is that they are manipulable, they're malleable, and that you can tap into their deepest desires or their deepest fears and use that to your own purposes. I don't think he felt that all those publics out there had reliable judgment, that they very easily might vote for the wrong man or want the wrong thing, so that they had to be guided from above.
One of Bernays' main clients was the giant United Fruit Company. They owned vast banana plantations in Guatemala in Central America. For decades, United Fruit had controlled the country through pliable dictators. It was known as a banana republic. But in 1950, a young officer, Colonel Arbenz, was elected president. He promised to remove United Fruit's control over the country. And in 1953, he announced the government would take over much of their land. It was a massively popular move, but a disaster for United Fruit, and they turned to Bernays to help get rid of Arbenz.
United Fruit brings in Bernays, and he basically understood that what United Fruit Company had to do was change this from being a popularly elected government that was doing some things that were good for the people there into this being very close to the American shore, a threat to American democracy, that it being at a time in the Cold War when Americans responded to issues of the Red Scare and what communism might do, he was trying to transform this and brilliantly did transform it into an issue of a communist threat very close to our shores, taking United Fruit again as a commercial client out of the picture and making it look like a question of American democracy, American values being threatened.
In reality, Arbenz was a democratic socialist with no links to Moscow. But Bernays set out to turn him into a communist threat to America. He organized a trip to Guatemala for influential American journalists. Few of them knew anything about the country or its politics. Bernays arranged for them to be entertained and to meet selected Guatemalan politicians who told them that Arbenz was a communist controlled by Moscow. During the trip, there was also a violent anti-American demonstration in the capital. Many of those who worked for United Fruit were convinced it had been organized by Bernays himself. He also created a fake independent news agency in America called the Middle American Information Bureau. It bombarded the American media with press releases saying that Moscow was planning to use Guatemala as a beachhead to attack America. All of this had the desired effect.
In Guatemala, the Jacob Arbenz regime became increasingly communistic after its inauguration in 1951. Communists in the Congress and high governmental positions controlled major committees, labor and farm groups, and propaganda facilities. They agitated and led in demonstrations against neighboring countries and the United States.
What was profoundly new in terms of what Bernays did is he took this menace to our backyard in Guatemala. For the first time, we saw Reds a couple hundred miles from New Orleans, who Eddie Bernays had us believing were a true threat to us, that it was going to be a Soviet outpost in our backyard.
But what Bernays was doing was not just trying to blacken the Arbenz regime. He was part of a secret plot. President Eisenhower had agreed that America should topple the Arbenz government, but secretly. The CIA were instructed to organize a coup. Working with the United Fruit Company, the CIA trained and armed a rebel army and found a new leader for the country called Colonel Armas. The CIA agent in charge was Howard Hunt, later one of the Watergate burglars.
What we wanted to do was have a terror campaign to terrify Arbenz particularly, terrify his troops, much as the German Stuka bombers terrified the population of Holland, Belgium, and Poland at the onset of World War II, and just rendered everybody paralyzed.
As planes flown by CIA pilots dropped bombs on Guatemala City, Edward Bernays carried on his propaganda campaign in the American press. He was preparing the American population to see this as the liberation of Guatemala by freedom fighters for democracy.
He totally understood that the coup would happen when the public and the press, when conditions in the public and the press allowed for a coup to happen, and he created those conditions. He was totally savvy in terms of just what he was helping create there in terms of this overthrow. But ultimately he was reshaping reality, reshaping public opinion in a way that's undemocratic and manipulative.
On June the 27th, 1954, Colonel Arbenz fled the country, and Armas arrived as the new leader. Within months, Vice President Nixon visited Guatemala. In an event staged by United Fruit's PR department, he was shown piles of Marxist literature that had been found, it was said, in the presidential palace.
This is the first time in the history of the world that the communist government has been overthrown by the people. And for that, we congratulate you and the people of Guatemala for the support they have given. And we are sure that under your leadership, supported by the people whom I have met by the hundreds on my visit to Guatemala, that Guatemala is going to enter a new era in which there will be prosperity for the people together with liberty for the people. Thank you very much for allowing us to see this exhibit of communism in Guatemala. You're welcome.
And for dinner, see what Mother has for dessert. Banana gingerbread shortcake. Just another of the many tempting ways in which this nutritious fruit can be prepared. So now that you've seen where bananas come from before they reach your table, our journey to Banana Land is ended. We hope you enjoyed the trip. We know you like bananas.
Bernays had manipulated the American people, but he had done so because he, like many others at the time, believed that the interests of business and the interests of America were indivisible, especially when faced with the threat of communism. But Bernays was convinced that to explain this rationally to the American people was impossible, because they were not rational. Instead, one had to touch on their inner fears and manipulate them in the interests of a higher truth. He called it the engineering of consent.
So there we have it. Edward Bernays essentially sets up a fake news agency, the Middle American Information Bureau, to put out news releases that connect Arbenz, popularly elected, democratically elected leader in Guatemala, who happens to conflict with the corporate interests of United Fruit Company, and so they make him out to be a socialist connected to Soviet Russia in order to remove him and install a pliable dictator, which is where we get the term Banana Republic, that's friendly to United Fruit Company. So fake news, as we've seen, no different than what we have today, and this was all the way back in the 50s. So they stirred up, once again, people's feelings and emotions in order to create the necessary conditions to go in and do operations in Guatemala that would not be rejected by the public. So for those that think you're not manipulated in the same way today, I'm not sure you're living in the same world that we live in. And just to further illustrate the point, here is Darren Brown. He is an illusionist, and he has a lot of popular television programs on the subject of, similar to a David Blaine in the United States. And here we're going to see how he uses subliminal messages to manipulate people's minds. So once again, just illustrating, you are manipulated on a daily basis through popular media, your favorite movies, television, music, news sources, which are essentially used as psyops, as social engineering, to steer you to certain conclusions on social and political issues and cultural issues. And as you saw with the previous clip and this clip that follows, it does work.
Shopping malls, modern cathedrals to spending money. They're designed to disorientate us and make us stay longer than we need to. Every brick is there to manipulate us to buy. It's the perfect place to find a large number of compliant people to affect.
Welcome to the Whitgift Centre, Croydon. We hope your shopping experience has been uplifting enough, and I'd like to bring to your pay attention some very special offers today.
What you hear in the background is a Tannoy announcement I pre-recorded and played through the shopping centre.
So why not come right on up and see for yourself?
After half an hour of absorbing it, they should be ready for a final message. Welcome to the Whitgift Centre, Croydon. We hope your shopping experience is an uplifting arm, and I'd like to bring to your pay attention some very special offers today.
Details of our special offers can be found handily by the lifts, so why not come right on up and see for yourself? These offers will only be
Available for a short period of time, so all customers wishing to reach up and grab this exciting opportunity should do it now.
I was shopping around with my friends, and all of a sudden my hand just went up, and I don't know what happened. It was quite embarrassing, but I don't know, it just feels weird.
We're just walking around, and we heard him speaking, and just everyone put their hand up at the same time.
It made me feel better because everyone was doing it at the same time, but I just didn't know why I'd done it.
They're being brainwashed.
She's correct. Everybody's being brainwashed pretty much on a daily basis. And so it's just a little more well hidden than what you see in communist China, North Korea, and the like. Whether it's fake news repeated on a loop 24/7 on your favorite news source, or subliminal messaging as we've seen in this clip, or other more advanced techniques, all this has been perfected in the last 100 years to essentially brainwash the public, to get you to believe certain things once again on social issues, political issues, issues of culture. And that continues today, including what we've seen in the news over the last week or so, well, since the end of May, now with the issue of race. And as we know, George Floyd kicked this off, that whole tragic situation. And then in the last couple of days we had this shooting in Atlanta. It's interesting, right as the outrage over the George Floyd death, false flag, whatever you'd like to call it, as soon as that was starting to die out and peter out, now we have a new situation where someone in Atlanta was shot, a black gentleman, by two white police officers. Kind of convenient, the timing of this, as the outrage from the last event was fading away. So I have a hard time believing that this just conveniently happened right at the perfect time. I would have to say, if I was guessing, that it was probably another false flag. But in any event, we have another event that was meant to stoke and continue to fan the flames of racial division and tension, to potentially start a race war or civil war. And so that brings us to earlier this week. There was a roundtable event held in Dallas with some political leadership, black leaders, some clergy leaders from the community there in Dallas, and A.G. Barr was there, for example. And so this roundtable was meant to discuss race relations, among other things, and here we have, at the end of it, a lot of interesting things said during that roundtable. If you want to watch it, it's about 2 hours long. So it is, I just wanted to pull one part that would be relative to what we're talking about here in this video, and that's Bishop Harry Jackson. And he's going to talk a little bit about how President Trump is being blamed for essentially issues that go back hundreds of years that have nothing to do with him in the area of race. So let's take a look at what Bishop Harry Jackson has to say.
strength and everything else, and I appreciate it very much.
And I apologize for the audio on this video. It's very low, so you'll have to do the best you can with this. I raised it as much as I could.
Thank you. Can I add one last thing, please?
Please.
I'm tired of people blaming the current administration and others in our generation. These problems began many years ago. And what has been exciting to me is it was the church that began the abolitionist movement. It was the church and whites and blacks working together that started the NAACP.
And that's where we're going to go in the remainder of this video. We'll continue with Bishop Jackson, but this is what's really being lost right now and is never really touched on in the media narrative and the academic narrative surrounding race relations in the United States and the issue of slavery, is that actually, historically, the people that led the movement for the abolition of slavery, for civil rights, were actually white Christians. And they'll never tell you that, secular historians, the secular media, because they don't want you to know that. And it's actually a source of unity between the races to point this out, is that the greatest ally in the fight for equal rights for black people in terms of abolition of slavery and civil rights movement were white Christians, and particularly white Christian men. And usually we're demonized in the media as the opposite, and it just doesn't bear out historically. And we'll take a look at some of that information as to how really the greatest allies for racial equality were with black people were white Christians.
We didn't have a black leader at the beginning of time. It was a church that led through in the civil rights movement. So I want to offer you my support in these listening sessions in that the church needs to come together. I believe we can unify better than any group. And what we're looking for you to do is to give structural guidance, which you're working on, and you've already brought forth some amazing things. But I want to affirm that Democrats can't kneel down and wear kente cloth and stop black pain. Republicans can't take some one-time act and stop black pain. But I believe we've got a man here who's courageous enough to begin something that's tough and that we're going to this time heal. And so I weep over this. I pray for you, as you know. And we believe that we're going to get it right. I got to say one last thing. I lost my late wife a couple years ago. I found out in dealing with her that sometimes you just got to listen, feel her pain. If you try to fix it too early, you're going to make a mistake. Sure, listening sessions are wise because it's going to give that cathartic process a chance. So I don't want to take up too much time, sir, but I wanted to say that the people here, I challenge you, Christians, black, white, Asian, let's come together and let's provide a safety net, and then we'll work with business, and then we'll work along with the administration. But don't push them out here up front and say, fix it now, fix it now, fix it now, fix it now, because it's never worked that way. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Aaron.
So some really nice words there by Bishop Harry Jackson, highlighting the fact that Christianity from the very beginning has been the source of the movements that led to the abolition of slavery, civil rights, etc. And, you know, in particular, white Christians played a central role in these movements. And so even today, where the media wants to artificially divide us through these events that were mentioned, this is a source of unity that never gets mentioned because they don't want people to know this, that both blacks and whites were unified and worked together to help effect change in the area of slavery and civil rights. And so that takes us to an article here, and we'll read through the whole article because I think it encapsulates best the information that I looked at when preparing this video. There was just a myriad of articles and sources of information to go through to prepare some material for this video, and it would take days and days to go through it all. It did take lots of time to collate it all. And so this one in particular kind of encapsulates, synthesizes most of that information. And so we'll read through this article here first. It's titled How a Secular Jew Proved Christians Ended Slavery. In the debate over social justice, and by the way, for those that follow QAnon, you'll find some phrases in here that you might recognize. So, in the debate over social justice and reparations, many claims are being made about slavery. Now, this article, once again, was back in 2013, I believe. Or no, sorry, looks like 2019. In the debate over social justice and reparations, many claims are being made about slavery. Christians are now debating about how complicit earlier Christians were in slavery. Below, I answer some questions about how Robert W. Fogel, a former communist, a secular Jew, arguably the foremost scholar on American slavery, who won a Nobel Prize for his work, concluded that Christians ended slavery. A version of this was originally posted at acton.org. And it starts out here, question: what made you write about Professor Fogel now? Answer: I recently saw a Christian intellectual scoff at the idea that Christians ended slavery, holding the suggestion up for mockery, suggesting it was a conservative's simplistic caricature of history, embarrassing to other Christians. The Christian scholar apparently had no idea of what Professor Fogel proved. In the recent social justice debate, some one-sided information is getting thrown around about how evangelical Christians supported slavery, discouraging us. Question: who was Professor Fogel? Answer: in his youth, he spent 8 years campaigning for communism. Eventually, he rejected it. He pioneered an approach to history that relied on quantifiable data, that is, concrete documentation like government records, the business ledgers of plantations. He calculated that Southern slavery was 36% more efficient than free Northern farms, and that the Southern economy was growing at double the rate as the North's in the 10 years before the Civil War. He also found some facts about how slaves were treated that were controversial, like that they ate more calories and lived longer than Northern city dwellers. Some people misused his findings to defend slavery, but that wasn't at all his intention. In 1993, he won the Nobel Prize in Economics on the basis of his work on slavery. Question: if slavery was profitable and provided relatively good material lives for slaves, how did Americans awake to the fact that it was evil? Answer: that's the key question, especially for an economist. They usually assume that what is efficient succeeds and spreads, but wasn't ended by slavery he's talking about here, but wasn't ended by economics, but by what Christians taught. More and more, especially after the Great Awakening, Christians saw that slavery and racism violate the Golden Rule. Professor Fogel saw that Christians turned the tide of popular opinion against slavery, so that by 1860, people were willing to vote for an anti-slavery president. Question: don't you have a personal connection with Professor Fogel? Answer: yes, I took his class at the University of Chicago. For that class, I wrote a paper in which I argued about the condition of evangelicals. He had written a book in 2000, The Fourth Great Awakening and the Future of Egalitarianism, in which he argued that evangelicals would lead the USA forward to moral progress just as they had led the end of slavery. I disagreed with him, an evangelical telling a Jew that his positive view of current-day evangelicals was too rosy. He invited me to his office and we had a congenial conversation, me trying to show him that Christians have lost some of the Puritan ethic. We didn't change each other's minds, but the next year he asked me to be his teaching assistant. Imagine a professor asking the student who dared disagree with him to be his teaching assistant. He even gave me the job of giving the lecture about his findings on slavery. Once, while chatting after class, he told me that he was astounded to discover that Christians ended slavery. He confessed that he had been a professor in some of America's leading universities, yet had no idea that Christians had ended slavery. And I can tell you from all of my studies on the subject in middle school, high school, college, after that, never once did anybody mention this at all. And so we continue. Question: how did Christians turn the tide of opinion in the USA against slavery? Answer: the Puritans from New England and the Quakers in Pennsylvania first turned against slavery. In 1700, a New England Puritan, Samuel Sewall, wrote one of the earliest books against slavery, The Selling of Joseph. The abolitionists were motivated by their Christian principles. The Great Awakening was a revival of Puritanism, and as the descendants of Puritans spread across the northern USA, they spread the Puritan ethic, thus spreading opposition to slavery. Northern Protestants coalesced into the new Republican Party, so the Republican Party had a strong evangelical element with the intention of applying Christian principles, especially as priority number one, the abolition of slavery. But weren't some Christians like Jonathan Edwards slaveholders? Yes, sad to say that's true. Edwards owned a few slaves, but his principles, set on fire by the Great Awakening, helped ignite the abolition movement. Some of his followers, like Samuel Hopkins, and even his own son, Jonathan Edwards the Younger, became fierce opponents of slavery. The ministers inspired by Edwards denounced slavery in their evangelistic preaching. Question: what implication does this have for the reparations for slavery debate? Answer: it doesn't mean that we whitewash slavery, that we downplay it as some Christians have foolishly done. We don't say it wasn't so bad and so doesn't deserve restitution. It was a horrible thing because human beings are not commodities and are each made in the image of God, not to be lorded over by masters who think they can be God to others. But it does mean the material loss to slaves have often been exaggerated, especially if we compare the current living standards of descendants of slaves in America to where they came from. Further, some reparations were already paid in the enormous sacrifice the USA paid to free slaves, including over 350,000 men. There he's referring to the 350,000 soldiers from the North that fought to abolish slavery. Also, I believe the Bible forbids punishing people for the sins of their ancestors, Ezekiel 18:20. Reparations would necessarily do that, as the money would have to come from people who didn't commit the sin being restituted. Thus, that would be unjust. Finally, as I said, if we go back far enough, all of us probably have a slave and slaveholder in our pedigree, and I would argue also you probably have an abolitionist in your background as well. There was a large amount of people who were involved in the abolition movement, white Christians particularly, as he stated earlier, Puritans and Quakers from Pennsylvania. We're all children of slaves and enslavers, and once again I would add abolitionists. Where will the grievances stop if we try to repair those 5 generations ago? It should stop with every generation. The secret to racial harmony is truth and forgiveness, not a check. And so, I would agree with him here to a certain extent. Probably many of you have seen the videos in the past week or so from people like Lil Wayne, some other celebrities like he played in Shawshank Redemption, and I'll remember his name later. Anyways, he's been around forever, and he says in a CNN interview, which I think was with Piers Morgan, where he talks, Morgan Freeman. He's having an interview with, I think, Piers Morgan, where he's saying, what should we do to remedy race relations? And he says, basically, just stop talking about it. And so in order to move forward, we would all have to entertain some degree of forgiveness in order to unify and continue moving forward. Today, some Christian intellectuals scold the church for being complicit in slavery. What are they missing? They're right, of course, he continues, but they're not telling the whole story. There's no excuse for complicity with slavery, especially the race-based slavery of the South. But what they fail to see is that slavery was a universal human institution. It had been normal for all of history. If we go back into anyone's family tree far enough, we'll almost certainly find a slave owner. We're all descended from slaves and slave owners. So once again, I'd add abolitionists as well, or Northerners who participated in the Civil War. So the question isn't who enabled slavery. The whole world did. The question is who put an end to it. Christians did. Sure, we have the normal people who defended slavery to be ashamed of, but what's amazing is that we have the courageous saints who read their Bible, were fueled by the Holy Spirit, and saw that they couldn't love their neighbor as themselves and enslave him, or sit back quietly and allow him to be enslaved by others. We have a great heritage to celebrate. So this takes us to kind of slavery as an institution. It's helpful if we go back and take a look at a timeline of slavery and see what we're talking about from its beginnings. And as noted in that article there, slavery is nothing that's unique to human history, even though it seems that way, because we're the only ones that seem to have produced movies about it, movies, television, music, these kind of things, because we are the world's media producer in these avenues. Everybody knows our history very well as it relates to slavery, but this was not a unique problem to the United States. This was actually a universal human construct. Slavery goes back to the very beginning of human civilization, the beginning of human history, and it is basically part and parcel of everyone's history. It extended to all peoples, all nations, all cultures, all groups from all times. Once again, to emphasize, this is not a uniquely American problem. This is a human problem. And once again, going back from looking at things from a Judeo-Christian worldview, we would say that this is a human problem because of original sin. That because man is sinful by nature in thought, word, and deed, we have used the institution of slavery from the very beginning because we are, as human beings, corrupt by nature. And so we find this institution thousands of years before the United States was ever founded. And as we'll see as we look further in our study, actually from the very beginning, going back all the way to the 1600s, Americans, Christian Americans, were the first voices to protest against it because of their Holy Spirit-driven convictions on the value placed on all life. All life is worthy of value, dignity, worth, and respect because we are all image bearers of God. And so this is where we find our fundamental protest pours out of these values that are found in the Judeo-Christian worldview. And so to examine the timeline on this issue, we go back to the time of Christ. So he's walking around and executed around 29 AD. And then a short time after that, you have the birth of the Christian church. Eventually they get expelled from Jerusalem. And then you have the destruction of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD by the Romans. And so from these events, Christians scatter abroad and start to flourish and multiply throughout the Roman Empire and Europe until we get to the 300s, where Augustine declares Christianity as the established religion of the Roman Empire. Slavery is condemned as sinful, and by 400, because of Christianity and thoughts on morality, slavery is in sharp decline. And some of the main causes of slavery being in sharp decline being Christian morality, Also a growing Germanic population that had very few slaves, and also partly due to the waning Roman military power, and thus Roman military power producing fewer captives to enslave. Meanwhile, during this time, Christianity bridged the divide between free people and slaves, as both worshiped together, as we'll see later in the letter of Paul in the book of Philemon, where we have one instance where this takes place when a slave converts to Christianity. And so then moving ahead, during the Middle Ages, there was very little slavery in Christian lands due to these reasons. And then in the 600s and 700s, you have Muslim conquest of Christian territory in the Near East, Africa, Spain, and Mediterranean, which reintroduced slavery where Christianity had eradicated it. And so from that point, we move forward with very little slavery until we get to the 1400s. And in the 1400s, with the advent of widespread exploration by ship, along with the nexus of politics and economics, which took precedence over morality, we find that slavery becomes profitable on a large scale and begins to flourish. During the Middle Ages, trade with China and the Indies opened up along the Silk Road, which took place going through the Middle East and Central Asia. The problems with this were that it was a very long and dangerous journey, and that the road was frequently closed by hostile forces. So then, in the 15th century, the Portuguese became the dominant seafarers of the time and established an alternate, safer route through the sea, around the coast of Africa, and onward east, which became the main route of trade with the East, bypassing the Silk Road by way of sea. And so this trade route had many African ports where black slaves pre-existed and were held by Africans. Eventually, Portuguese ships, of course going into port, introduced African slaves to Europe in 1441, and by the 1600s, Europeans took up the slave trade on the West African coasts, including nations like Spain, France, England, and other European countries, which got in on the economic activity of the slave trade. So from there, in 1619, the first Dutch slave ship arrives in America, in Jamestown, Virginia, and then with the advent of trade of sugarcane and tobacco from the Caribbean and cotton from the United States, we see the slave trade start to boom in the United States. So we have kind of an explosion of the West African slave trade from the 1400s to the 1600s, thanks to shipping by Western European nations. And so from that timeline, we see the beginning also of Protestant Christian movement from Western Europe to the United States to escape religious persecution. And so these two timelines start to coincide, and immediately in the 1600s, when you see a lot of people from Western Europe, white Protestant Christians arriving, there is almost an immediate aversion and protest against slavery. And it begins with the Puritans in the Northeast and the Quakers from Pennsylvania. So in 1641, slavery is legalized in Massachusetts, and 40 years later, 1688, so within the same generation, you see the Germantown, Pennsylvania Quakers petition against slavery. The Pennsylvania Quakers passed the first formal anti-slavery resolution in what would become the United States. So from the beginning of the foundations of the country, a lot of people like to say the United States was founded as a racist nation. It's just not accurate. It's just not true. From the beginnings of the creation and legalization of slavery, there were opponents to it in the form of Protestant Christians, Quakers, and Puritans. So from the beginnings of the nation, you have people who are protesting against it. And then in 1758, and once again, all of this predates the revolution, predates the founding, the Declaration of Independence, and the creation of the Constitution. All of the beginnings of the protests against slavery as an institution far predate by at least 100 years the Civil War. So for people who are African American, for people who are white, despite being taught in your universities and popular media that America is a racist nation from the foundation of the creation of the country, you can rest and feel comfortable and proud of the fact that actually it's the opposite. From the beginnings of the nation, there were large amounts of people who protested against slavery because of their religious Judeo-Christian convictions. And so in 1758, at the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting of Quakers, Quakers forbid its members from owning slaves or participating in the slave trade. Quakers continue to play an active role in the abolition movement. And then in 1775, the Society for the Relief of Free Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage, that's the name of this society, the nation's first abolition society, is founded in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Once again, Pennsylvania at that time was dominated by Quakers. And so we see organized opposition to this in the United States. And once again, the United States led the way in this movement. This resurgence of slavery, which began in the slave trade in the 1400s until the 1600s. And then we see organized movements against what was a very popular business. You know, once again, politics follows the money. There's a saying in politics that it's the golden rule, he who has the gold makes the rules. And that's the way it's always been. And so there really was no will to condemn slavery unless you had Judeo-Christian values. It was very profitable, extremely profitable, to be involved in the slave trade. There would have been no reason to stop it unless for the religious convictions of Christianity. But so from the beginnings, you see Puritans and Quakers organizing against slavery, forming societies to combat slavery, and we lead the way, as we tend to do in the United States. There's a saying, when the United States catches cold, when the United States sneezes, the whole world catches cold. And so, as we saw in my previous videos, as I mentioned, America is the last stop for freedom. If America goes dark, the world goes dark, and that's why it's so important, and that's why it's played such a leading role from the foundation of its history. If we don't protect freedom in the United States, it will fall everywhere, and there will be nowhere to escape to at that point. And so from the beginning, from the foundations of our country, even before the Declaration of Independence, even before the Constitution, we played a leading role in stopping slavery and being a leader in morality and the rights of other human beings. And so at the same time, you had people in Britain who picked up this fight as well. So once again, these were Christians, in particular white Christians, Quakers, Protestants, along the same time frame, late 1600s into the 1700s, who picked up on what was taking place in the United States in the area of abolition of slavery. They were guided, once again, by their Judeo-Christian values and could not abide in the continuing institution of slavery. And so in 1785 at Cambridge, there's a student named Thomas Clarkson, and he enters a Latin essay contest where the topic given is it lawful to enslave the unconsenting? And so he reads everything he can get his hands on regarding the subject, including various works by people involved in the abolition movement in the United States. Well, at that point it wasn't the United States. Well, it was 1785. But he reads works predating the revolution. And one of those works was by a gentleman named Anthony Benezet. Anthony Benezet was an American abolitionist from Pennsylvania who once again had a Quaker background. And Benezet's family were originally French Huguenots, Protestants, who first migrated to Britain where they became Quakers while in exile there, and then moved around Europe a little bit, and then eventually fled religious prosecution as Protestants to America. And from there, he gets involved in the abolition movement and has various writings that Thomas Clarkson read. And Thomas Clarkson becomes a leader in the British abolition movement. And from there, Thomas Clarkson goes on to influence a British lawmaker named William Wilberforce. And Wilberforce was one of the fathers of British abolition, who started in the late 1700s until it was finally approved abolition legislation in the early 1800s. Wilberforce was joined by an Anglican minister, an evangelical, and former slave trader named John Newton. John Newton wrote an influential tract on the horrors of the slave trade, which he participated in, and helped turn the tide of opinion toward the abolition of slavery. And then Newton also wrote a little well-known song you might have heard of called Amazing Grace. So we have the abolition movement started in the United States by white Christians, Puritans, Quakers. This movement is picked up upon by similar Protestant elements in Britain at around the same time, Quakers and the like. And from there you have the abolition of slavery in Britain, and it takes a little bit longer to take place in the United States until the Civil War, where you have 350,000 men give their lives in the cause of slavery by people from the North. So even though we're browbeat on a continual basis about the United States' role and history of slavery, we can be proud in the fact from our beginnings we organized against the horrors of slavery to the point that eventually men were willing to give their lives, almost 500,000 people, in the cause of black slavery rights and the fight for equality. So there's something to be proud of there. Now, some people would argue, and you do hear this a lot, as one criticism of slavery. Well, isn't slavery sanctioned in the Bible? And it's not accurate, actually, even though the Bible does touch on slavery in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And this is a popular misunderstanding by people who really haven't studied the subject, as always. You find this when you are arguing with liberals. Quite often they haven't done their homework on the very issue they pretend to be experts on. And so what you find in the Bible, in the Old Testament and the New Testament, is a form of slavery that is essentially indentured servitude, not the slavery that we find in pre-Civil War United States, antebellum chattel Civil War, as it's known in pre-Civil War United States. The slavery that's mentioned that we'll take a look at here in just a minute in the Bible refers to indentured servitude. So if you owed a debt to somebody that you couldn't pay back monetarily, or for example, if you were paying a dowry for a wife, which of course existed back then and still exists in some places today, you worked off that debt. And so, as it's mentioned in the Old Testament and New Testament, this is the type of slavery that the Bible is referring to. It's debt slavery. It's voluntary, where people are paying off a debt that they couldn't otherwise pay off. And actually, as we'll see in scriptures that we'll look at in just a minute, the Bible specifically prohibits slavery, antebellum chattel slavery, and it also provides a framework of protection for people who were working in indentured servitude in the form of debt slavery, which some of these terms, slavery in the Old Testament and New Testament, would maybe be more accurately be translated as servant, which we'll see. And so, once again, just keep in mind, today we have bankruptcy. So you can declare bankruptcy if you owe a debt that you cannot pay. They didn't have that back in these ancient civilizations and in the ancient world, which is the context that the Bible is writing in. So they're using indentured servitude. And so we'll take a look at a little bit of further study on this subject. The first video we'll take a look at, if you watched any of my previous videos, this was a gentleman that was in the other videos, at least one of them that I mentioned. His name is Frank Turek. He is a Bible scholar, biblical apologist that gives lectures and debates on college campuses, and in this particular situation, he is debating with well-known atheist Michael Shermer. And so we'll take a look at his thoughts on slavery in the Bible.
Okay, in the 16th, 17th, 18th, and throughout most of the 19th century, most Christians endorsed slavery. Today, none would. So the arguments they made are just like yours. It's objectively correct. It's right. It's good for blacks. It says so in the Bible. It's and so on. They made all these arguments that nobody would make today. Something dramatic happened. Why do you think slavery is wrong now, and why was it okay back 2 centuries ago? What happened? What happened biblically or theologically, or did God have a new revelation to somebody and say, you know what, that was a bad idea?
Yes. In fact, if you just give me just 1 second here. Stand by for Victor's victory.
In other words, the creator of the universe wrote a book.
Yeah.
And he didn't even get it right on slavery. Much less women's rights.
Actually, he did.
Much less women's rights. Gay rights.
Can you give me the
any other rights?
Hey,
yeah, go ahead.
Chris, can you give me the PowerPoint here? First of all, Old Testament slavery was not race-based forced servitude. It was voluntary means of working off debt or keeping captives from mustering a rebellion.
So we'll continue with the video in just a minute, but as I said, it's voluntary means of working off debt. And there is one specific mention of this in the Old Testament that I think is worth taking a look at, which is from Genesis 29. And in this, Jacob, whose name is later changed to Israel, and the people who follow a Judeo-Christian worldview, we would say we follow the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so Jacob here is going to find a wife in the land of his ancestors. And so we'll pick it up here from verse 1. It says, "Then Jacob went on his journey and came into the land of the people of the east. And he looked, and behold, a well in the field, and lo, there were flocks of sheep lying by it. For out of that well they watered the flocks. And a great stone was upon the well's mouth. And thither there were all the flocks gathered. And they rolled the stone from the well's mouth, and watered the sheep, and put the stone again upon the well's mouth in his place. And Jacob said unto them, My brethren, whence be ye? And they said, Of Haran. So where are they from? They're from Haran. And he said unto them, Know ye Laban, the son of Nahor? And they said, We know him. And he said unto them, Is he well? And they said, He is well. And behold, Rachel his daughter cometh with sheep. And he said, Lo, yet it is yet high day, neither is it time that the cattle should be gathered together. Water ye the sheep, and go feed them. And they said, We cannot until all the flocks be gathered together, until they roll the stone from the well's mouth, then we water the sheep. And while he yet spake with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she kept them. So Laban is actually Jacob's uncle, and Rachel is his cousin. Now we have to keep in mind, back in this time, excuse me, Genesis is still very close to the creation. And as it was very close to creation, their genetics were still very pure. And so they didn't have the restrictions on marrying somebody who was a cousin. So we find this a lot in Genesis, where somebody's marrying their cousin or a close relation. For example, going back to the creation, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, this sort of thing. So later on, as time goes by and creation continues to degrade because of sin entering the world and original sin, things get worse and worse, including genetics. And so from that point on, you have a prohibition from intermarrying and producing children with people who were closer relation. So in some places, as I said in Genesis, you see people marrying what we would consider today to be close relatives, which you'll see in this case. So Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she kept them. And it came to pass, when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, that Jacob went near, and rolled the stone from the well's mouth, and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. And Jacob kissed Rachel, probably just a general greeting kiss. He wasn't making out with her at this point, and lifted up his voice and wept. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's brother, not his brother exactly. This just means familial relation, so in this case cousin, or nephew rather, and that he was Rebekah's son, Rebekah once again being Laban's sister. And she ran and told her father. And it came to pass, when Laban heard the tidings of Jacob, his sister's son, that he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his house. And he told Laban all these things. And Laban said to him, Surely thou art my bone and my flesh. And he abode with him the space of a month. And Laban said unto Jacob, Because thou art my brother, once again, not literal brother, but relative, kin, shouldest thou therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what shall thy wages be? And Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. And Leah was tender-eyed, but Rachel was beautiful and well-favored. So Jacob loved Rachel, and said, I will serve thee 7 years for Rachel, thy younger daughter. And Laban said, It is better that I give her to thee, than that I should give her to another man. Abide with me. So Jacob agrees to serve Laban, his uncle, for 7 years, because 7 years was the space of time that indentured servants typically served their master, quote unquote, and so he makes an agreement to serve Laban for 7 years. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed unto him but a few days for the love that he had to her. Now, as mentioned earlier, Rachel was beautiful, but Leah, on the other hand, was not as beautiful as Rachel. And and Jacob said unto Laban, Give me my wife, for my days are fulfilled, that I may go into her. That term, go into her, means basically to physically consummate the relationship. So he served for 7 years. And Laban gathered together all the men of the place, and made a feast. And it came to pass in the evening that he took Leah his daughter, and brought her to him, and he went in unto her. So he consummated his marriage, not with who he thought he was consummating, but with Leah rather. And Laban gave unto his daughter Leah Zilpah, his maid, for a handmaid. And it came to pass that in the morning, behold, it was Leah. And he said to Laban, What is this thou hast done to me? Did I not serve thee for Rachel? Wherefore then hast thou beguiled or deceived me? And Laban said, It must not be so done in our country to give the younger before the firstborn. Fulfill her week. This week refers to week of years, so 7 years. And we will give thee also for the service which thou shalt serve with me yet 7 other years. Basically, Laban tricks Jacob and gives Leah, his firstborn daughter, the one that Jacob is not in love with, as a wife. So Jacob serves for 7 years, thinks he's getting Rachel, the beautiful daughter of Laban that he's in love with, and instead he gets Leah, the one who's not so beautiful. Now it's interesting because earlier in the story in Genesis, Jacob was also a bit deceptive. He stole his older brother's birthright and took the special blessing from his father. He deceives his father and gets the special blessing for the birthright. And so now here the favor has been returned to him, and he was deceived, served for 7 years, and instead of getting Rachel, gets Leah as a wife, and has to now serve another 7 years to receive Rachel. And Jacob did so and fulfilled her week and served 7 years, and he gave him Rachel, his daughter, to wife also. And Laban gave to Rachel his daughter Bilhah, his handmaid, to her maid, and he went in unto Rachel, and he loved also Rachel more than Leah, and served with him yet another 7 years. So here we have the biblical version of indentured servitude playing out, where he serves 14 years to his master, his uncle Laban. And so Frank Turk continues here. Let's back up just a couple seconds.
From mustering a rebellion. Secondly, slave trading is condemned in the Bible, both in the Old and the New Testaments. Thirdly,
so let's take a look at these verses he's got listed here. Slave trading is condemned in the Old and New Testament, particularly Ezekiel 21:16. So in Ezekiel 21, here we're seeing a whole list of restrictions here, once again, that are laid out for people's protection. That's what the Old Testament says here. So where do we want to look at here? So basically they're laying out the Old Testament law here, and going through various laws that are to be prohibited. And it says, he that smiteth a man so that he die, he shall surely be put to death. And if a man lie not in wait, but God deliver him into his hand, then I will appoint thee a place whither he shall flee. But if a man come presumptuously upon his daughter, upon his neighbor, to slay him with guile, thou shalt take him from mine altar, that he may die. And he that smiteth his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. And if he stealeth a man and selleth him, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. So, if somebody steals a man and sells him, like in slavery, let's see, the word here. The word here is can be used as servant. So if he steals a servant, if he steals a man, anybody, he is to be condemned. And in this case, stealing and selling a man, the penalty of which is death. So condemning slavery, condemning stealing, or enslaving a man, death. We also find that in, as he mentions in 1 Timothy 1. This is from the letters of Paul. And once again, the letters of Paul are written specifically to the Gentile church. So for those who are Christians, those are the letters in the New Testament that are specifically listed and written to Gentiles. So it was 1 Timothy 1, 10, and it reiterates essentially what the Old Testament said. For whoremongers, well, let's just go up to verse 8. It says, once again, reiterating that the law is meant to show man his sin, the Ten Commandments. That was the intent of the law and the Ten Commandments that God gave in the Old Testament. It says, but we know that the law is good if a man use it lawfully. But knowing this, that the law is not made for a righteous man, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the ungodly and for sinners, for unholy and profane, for murderers of fathers and murderers of mothers, for manslayers, for whoremongers, for them that defile themselves with mankind, for men stealers, for liars, for perjured persons, and if there be any other things that is contrary to sound doctrine. Well, once again, let's take a look at this word, men stealers, and what does it say here? This is a slave dealer, a kidnapper, a man stealer, one who unjustly reduces free men to slavery. So once again, Bible condemning people who are stealing and selling people for the purposes of slavery. Condemns it outright.
The Bible teaches that all men are made in the image of God. Slave and master are equally human, protected and one in Christ. That's throughout both Old and New Testaments. Fourthly, Jesus came to set the captives free. And fifth, the Bible's main goal is spiritual redemption, not social reform. The Old Testament was not ideal. It was forward-looking to a better testament, which is the New.
So let's go look at the last
The
thing
Old
he said.
Testament.
The Old Testament is for spiritual redemption, not social reform. But redemption achieves reform. And we see that in the information that we looked at earlier. What was the impetus for the Puritans and the Quakers to begin the abolition movement in the United States, which spread internationally to the Quakers and Protestants in Britain? It was the inward reform through Judeo-Christian values put forward in the Bible, which produced an outward faith, and the outcrop of that faith in this realm being the abolition of slavery. So inward spiritual redemption produces outward social reform due to the spiritual convictions of the Christians. So there's another short video we'll take a look at that further expounds on this idea, and let's take a look at that real quick.
It's a great question, and it's a simple question, but if you actually stop and reflect on it, there is so much historical complication and nuance to it. And the most critical thing I think to point out is when we use the word slavery in the modern world, we're approaching that idea and the word itself of slavery in a fundamentally different way than the ancient world did, particularly the context in which the scriptures were inspired by the Holy Spirit, written by human authors. So when we approach slavery, for example, in Philemon, we're talking about slavery in the Greco-Roman world, and in particular in the Roman Empire. And it was a very different institution than it was in the 18th and 19th centuries in the transatlantic world and the West African chattel slave trade. It's also worth pointing out that slavery in the Old Testament, you find, for example, Israel is in bondage. I mean, the Old Testament talks a lot about slavery, and it's very clear that Israel is suffering in bondage in Egypt, in enslavement, and that it is a wicked and abusive system. One of the things that's most critical to point out is that the scriptures, for example, in Exodus 21, condemns the kidnapping and sale of people, just flat out. And the modern slave trade, the slave trade that took men and women from West Africa, kidnapped them, sold them, put them on ships and brought them on the Middle Passage to the British colonies and then to the United States and sold them like cattle, that is expressly forbidden by the Bible, which prohibits kidnapping and selling people. So we can have clear moral authority from the scriptures, not just the New Testament, but from the Old Testament, that makes it very clear that slavery as practiced in the modern world, the modern slave trade, was antithetical to biblical justice and righteousness. And so when we talk about slavery in the ancient world, there are a couple differences worth pointing out. One, slavery in the Roman Empire, for example, was often an economic agreement, an arrangement, that sometimes these were conquered peoples that were subordinated to the conquering people. It was not perpetual, is the other thing worth pointing out. So it didn't transcend generations. The children of slaves were not, by nature of what family they were born into, they were not predestined, so to speak, or doomed to themselves to be enslaved. There were opportunities for exiting enslaved status. It was an economic arrangement. Secondly, slaves in the Roman Empire were often incredibly well educated. So you find, for example, members of the upper class who were taught by slaves. They were their teachers. And that's in stark contrast with what we find in the modern slave trade, where slaves, for example, in the American South, were forbidden from learning to read. Because slave masters in the South understood that if you let slaves learn how to read, they might read their Bibles, and they might actually start to raise questions about liberty. And so there was a profound difference in that category too, in that respect about slavery in the ancient world and in the modern world. And then third, and maybe most significantly, slavery in the ancient world, in the biblical world, was never racialized. When we talk about slavery in the modern world, this transatlantic kidnapping of men and women from, particularly from West Africa, and their transport to North America, we're talking about a whole system that was predicated upon the idea that one group of people, based on perceived physical appearances and differences, that they are somehow suited for enslavement in ways that others are not. And the whole idea of race gets constructed and developed in that context in the 18th and 19th centuries, the idea of blackness and whiteness, that blackness is what qualifies someone for subordination to enslavement, and whiteness is what keeps one exempt from that subordination. That is a very modern idea. And so when we come to the conversation about slavery in the Bible, when we read Paul appealing in Philemon about Onesimus, we're not talking about slavery as it existed in, say, Kentucky or Mississippi or Alabama in the 19th century. We're talking about something that was an economic arrangement in the Roman Empire. And nonetheless, even for all those differences, when Paul writes to Philemon, he calls on Philemon to receive Onesimus back, not as his slave, not as his servant, but as his brother in Philemon. And so Paul understands that when two men who previously had an economic arrangement, there was an employer and employee relationship, as soon as this one man now, Onesimus, has been converted, he's been brought into the family, into the household of God, his fundamental identity and relationship now with Philemon is going to be one of a brother, not an employee, not even a slave, but as a member of the household of God.
All right, so there we see in that last portion of the video, he's talking about Book of Philemon, where through conversion to Christianity, the master and the slave become one, unified and equal in the commonality of the faith. And so this was essentially what drove this section in Philemon, as well as the other scripture that we looked at from both the Old and New Testament. These were the scriptures and other ones that we didn't get to that form the basis for the worldview of the abolitionists that were populated by the early Americans, the Quakers, the Puritans, to abolish slavery, and something that we can be proud of in our history. So there's just a couple more to get to here, and there's another verse here we can take a look at in Deuteronomy, just to further emphasize, where it says, "Thou shalt not deliver unto his master the servant which has escaped from his master unto thee." So once again, protecting people who were servants during that time. And so I just want to re-emphasize, if you've been to university, if you follow the mainstream media, they love to teach that the United States is a foundationally racist country right from its foundations, right from the beginning. And it's actually the exact opposite. We can be proud of the United States and the role we played in being leaders in the movement for equality between the races, for abolishing slavery, and for leading in the area of civil rights. These are things that we can be proud of in our history. We were not the essentially, foundationally racist country that liberal university professors and the mainstream media like to teach. They don't teach any of these things that were mentioned in this video here, and these are points that are, I think, important for understanding, so that racial reconciliation can take place, something that is worth emphasizing. We from the very beginning we're a nation that believed in equal rights and the dignity of all human life. And it's something that needs to be mentioned, as it just is history that has conveniently been swept into the corner, been swept under the rug by people who don't find it convenient to their narrative of the United States as a racist country. And we're going to see this continuing into the fall. I'm sure they're going to try and push this race narrative as long as they can during the summer before they continue on with this COVID narrative, which they're obviously foreshadowing in the media right now. They're going to continue with that. But this race issue, they will push as long as they can, and it's going to be an issue into the fall as we're seeing both college and professional football players, NASCAR, professional sports like the NBA. All of these are taking up this issue now, and the NFL pledging to kneel during the national anthem, which is, look, both the flag, the Stars and Stripes, which were flown as symbols of the North in the Civil War, the flag and the national anthem are points of unity. These are points that are used to unify us despite our varied background, history and traditions and cultures, being that the U.S. is a multinational group of people, multi-ethnic group of people. These are points of unity, the flag and the national anthem. And, unfortunately, people who are following the mainstream narrative to actually promote division and racial tension and potential civil war, these people are being used through emotion to cause them to take a knee, in my view, something that's disrespectful to points of unity like the flag and like the national anthem. So we're going to see more of this in the future going into the fall, and it's important to remember that we have points of unity, not points of division, like the white Christian leadership that led the way in the abolition movement and the civil rights movement. So something to keep in mind as we move forward. And to sum all this up, I'll just take a look at two brief endings from two articles that I ran across in the midst of putting together this video. There were lots of articles to take a look at, and I could have included more of them, but it would have made things even longer than they already are. So to sum up, last 2 points, this from an article by Jeffrey B. Russell, who was a ancient medieval history professor from UC Santa Barbara. He ends his article here by saying, secular historians usually for ideological purposes grossly understate the importance of Christianity in abolition. It is important to note that slavery was immensely profitable in the Caribbean area as well as in the southern United States, and that it cost governments immense amounts of money to recompense slave owners for the confiscation of their property, quote unquote. The economic and political interests followed the money, so there was little or no political impetus to abolition. It was almost exclusively Christian moral leaders who achieved the freedom of the slaves, just as it was Christian moral leaders who began and fostered the civil rights movement of the 60s. Now, since slavery in many forms continues, for example in Libya, more remains to be done. And then final point from an article from the Town Hall written by Dinesh D'Souza. He says, so who killed slavery? The Christians did, while everyone else generally stood by and watched. And that's as true today as it ever was. So keep these things in mind as we move forward, and the mainstream media and academia continue to demonize the United States as a foundationally racist nation. It's just not accurate. I mean, even 100 years before the Revolutionary War and 200 years at least before the Civil War, we have people, white Christians, protesting for the abolition of slavery. So Please keep the U.S. in prayer, because the one thing that will heal the land and heal the people is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of the Bible. So keep the people in prayer, keep the land in prayer, that as we move forward, people will see through this false narrative. And once again, if you would like to support the channel, support the content of creation of additional content, or my various work with Christian missionary work, you can do so through the PayPal and Patreon links provided. So thank you once again for listening. I hope you found this helpful, and we'll see you on the next video.